So years ago, I learned this from a great mentor, Stephen R. Covey, and he had this statement that says, you can't talk your way out of a result you behaved your way into. And so you can't really talk yourself out of problems that I've had, that I create in my marriage. I need to learn how to behave my way out of them. So how do you make your marriage better without talking about it? Let me tell you, about 39 years ago, I blew it. I'd like to be able to share with you what I learned in that so that you don't have to be a Dave and make the same mistakes I made early in my marriage. Hi, my name is David Graff, and for over 25 years I've been using this model we're going to be talking about today in helping people from the living room to the boardroom. And that has been, we found success in both people's personal lives and their professional lives using this idea, the simple model that we're going to talk about today, about how do I really change my behavior, and that I don't necessarily can't talk my way out of a better relationship, but I can behave my way into a better relationship. So in this video, we're going to talk about where does that behavior come from? How do I change that behavior? And how do I ultimately improve the relationships that are most important to me? We all get stuck, we get complacent, and somehow we think that the most important relationships in our life, we don't have to really invest a lot of time and effort into. And so we go through behaving certain ways that create all kinds of problems. After 40 years of marriage, I've learned that first, if I want to improve my marriage and my relationship, I need to improve my behavior. So how do we go about doing that? Today, we're going to talk about ways in which you can understand where behavior comes from, and then how do we begin to change that behavior to be able to actually change and improve the relationships that are most important to us. Let me share with you a few secrets I've learned, and let me go back to that story I started with, where I really blew it. Came home from work one day, I had a dozen roses. I mean an expensive dozen roses, because I thought this is going to be amazing for my wife, and I'm going to show her how much I love and appreciate her. And as I walked in the door and gave her those roses, she looked at me and said, "Why in the world would you bring me roses that die? Why wouldn't you bring me something that I could plant or something that would live longer than just these? Why would you waste so much money on something that really isn't of value?" So how did I blow it? How did I in that moment not understand what was happening? See, my behavior was driven based off of my beliefs that I had developed. And one of the beliefs I had is if you love people, you give them expensive gifts. And so what I realized in this moment is that wasn't the same belief system that my wife had. So what I really realized is that my behaviors of things that I did, how I actually acted and behaved, was tied to these belief systems that were deep up inside my head. And they impacted the relationship, whether I understood it or not. So I want to share with you today where those belief systems start, how they drive our behaviors, and how they improve or hinder our ability to really be successful and get the results that we're needing to get in our most important relationships. And one of the things I've learned as I've gone through this idea of changing behavior and the impact is this. If I try to change a behavior in my work environment to make me more effective at work, it very rarely translates into my personal life. But if I can change the behavior in my personal life, it always translates into my professional life and makes me a more effective leader. So all the principles that I'm going to share with you, although at a personal nature, directly impact my ability to be a great leader. So let me show you how this model works. There's 3 key words on this model. We start with our belief systems, which then drive our behaviors, which ultimately end up who we've become as a human being. And all of us are at a certain point in time in our life where we are, and we are who we are. Now the question is, are there aspects in my life that are positive, that I really, really like about who I am and who I've become? And are there areas in my life that I know I need to improve? And in this case that we're talking about today is how do I, no kidding, focus on this relationship in my marriage to have great and wonderful relationships. So we're going to use this model to show how I begin to change, how you can begin to change in one of the most important relationships that are out there. So over the last 40 years, it took me 15 years to figure out what I'm going to share with you today. And that is some of those behaviors that I was exhibiting in my earlier marriage life was not producing the results that I wanted to get. In particular, one of the results that I really didn't realize at the time was this idea of trust, which is critical to our success. I mean, why would I not think that I could be trusted in my marriage or relationship? So I started looking at what are those things that I was doing, right, from a behavior perspective, that was impacting a low level of trust with my wife. And I started looking at things like bringing home roses when I really didn't understand what was important to her, by communicating in a very efficient way. Because, for me, sitting down and having a wonderful conversation wasn't that important to me. There was a lot of belief systems that I had that were driving a lot of the behaviors that were not producing the results that I wanted. So let's just take the idea of communication and listening. So what would I do? How would I behave? I would sit and I would listen for a few minutes, and then my comments were something along the lines of, you know what, can we talk about this later? I gotta go. And I didn't realize that every time I made that statement, I lost just a little bit of trust and confidence from my wife's perspective. Or we'd be out somewhere and she'd be wanting to tell me what was really, really important to her. And what I wanted to do was tell her, well, that might be important to you, but let me tell you what's really, really important to me. And so a lot of how I behaved in ways were much more self-centered. And so as I started to look at that and say, well, why do I do that? Why am I more interested in me than I am her? And what was the impact that was having? As I got up into my belief systems, I started analyzing, why do I do that? And honestly, what I came up with was, I really did believe, my belief system was that I'm actually more important than her. Not proud to admit that, but that was really the belief system I settled in on. That in terms of our relationship, I was way more important than she was. So you can see how that plays out. Here's my belief system. I'm more important than Sarah, which then says anytime we are interacting with each other, my behavior would exhibit that. And then I would get a result of poor communication, a result of poor communication, and then she would get upset and she'd get frustrated. And then what it taught me though then is I'd say, well, see, she's upset because I'm more important than her, right? So we can use this in a negative way also. What I realized is I needed to replace that belief system with something of greater significance. So what I ended up doing is I ended up sitting down and saying, what kind of husband do I really want to be? What are the things and what are the attributes that I see in what I believe are really, really good husbands that are out there? And what are the behaviors that they exhibited to show that? So I started looking at that, and one of the things that, several of the ideas that I came across were, well, one of the belief systems that I could put in my brain is that you are not the most important person in the world. And in fact, Sarah is the most important person to you in the world. Now imagine if I plugged that in and really started to believe that. What would happen? What would happen to my behavior? So I did start plugging it in. And over time, and we're not talking months, we're not even talking days or months, we're talking years. But over the years, 40 years of marriage, I can tell you today that Sarah is the most important person, and I behave in ways to show her that. Whereas she used to say to me early in our marriage, your actions are speaking so loud, I can't hear a word you're saying. So back to our original idea of this conversation is that my job is not to figure out how to talk myself into a good marriage. My challenge is, how do I behave myself into a good marriage? So we want to provide you an opportunity to be able to learn more about how you can understand yourself and understand those around you better, and particularly your spouse or partner, so that you can be more effective in those relationships. So down below, click on the link. It's a 4 lenses assessment. That assessment is going to measure 4 basic temperaments. Each of those temperaments have uniquenesses about them, like the rose story. My wife's temperament was was very clear of what money was to be used for. And my personality assessment was completely opposite. We had different belief systems on what money was for. So take the time down below, click on the link, take the assessment, and begin to work on yourself first and begin to learn to understand others. And by doing so, we invite you to join us on our mission to put the human back into humanity.